my pleasure to be here with my friend Carl and to give you two sort of different complementary sides of what bees are about in Singapore and a little bit globally. So I'm going to talk not just about bees in Singapore, but also about sort of the process of how we can do better citizen science and mobilize bee data. And I'm hoping that people might be inspired when they're out in the field. If you're already excited about butterflies or dragonflies or birds or something like that, maybe direct your camera towards at least some of the large, mega, giant bees like this one, and observe what they do. And eventually we'll try to put together a citizen science initiative that will really involve everybody and yield some great scientific dividends. So. Does everybody know this bee, or does anybody know this bee? This is what many people in Singapore call the bumblebee, but it's most definitely not a bumblebee. It's a large carpenter bee. It's actually a giant carpenter bee. This is the male, and he has giant eyes for finding his female mate, and he's got funny legs, which we'll see later. This is at Port Park. So I'm going to give at the start an introduction to bee research more from a global perspective to see what bee research is all about. Because one of the challenges is how do we do this type of research in a place like Singapore that has really tiny habitats? How do we replicate the excitement that we have globally in this place? And so I'll give some global examples to give you some context and then try to relate that back later in the talk to what we're doing in Singapore. I'll also talk about biodiversity portals and some tools that have been developed in places like the United States that might be applicable to Singapore if we can import it or develop similar technology. And then I'll get into the main focus of the talk, which is the Singapore bees and bee research. So this is Bukit Batok Nature Park with one of our most common bees, Nomia strigata, on one of our typical Singapore daisies, as it's called, right? So, before I came to Singapore, this is more what I thought bee research was about. You get in the car, you drive for tens or hundreds of miles through the open country, you find a big patch of flowers, get out, and you wander around in the desert looking for the bee nests. Kind of hard to replicate that in this region, I have to say. This is Arizona, sorry, this is New Mexico. You're right at the border of Mexico. And then once we find the nest of the bee, a lot of our activity is not looking for the bees themselves, but rather trying to find the nest, because only by finding the nest can we find their immature stages and really understand all aspects of their life history. We also find their parasites, which are actually even more interesting than the host bees themselves. Some of their parasites are actually other bees, as we will see. So this shows in a place like New Mexico all the bees that we might find wandering around in the countryside. And here's Mikakylie, which is the same genus we have in Singapore. And what you can see is every flower is going to have its own type of bee. So the bees have a lot of host specificity to their flowers. So just like many butterflies, they're great botanists. And when they see their flower and smell it and taste the nectar, they're quite constant within the species to that, and will collect pollen from the flower, and then crucially they'll pollinate the flowers. This is another aspect of bee research. It turns out that bees are most abundant and diverse in species in dry areas. Maybe not this dry, but certainly dry areas. So one of the challenges in Singapore is actually an inhospitable environment for many bees. Only those bees that have adapted to live in a place with very high humidity are able to survive here. So we get a very sort of special group of human-adapted bees that live in Singapore. But a lot of our bee research happens in a place like this is in Israel. Turns out there's a ton of bees in even the extreme desert like this. What we really, really want to find is a bee nest site. This is something we have not been able to find in Singapore, but this is our dream, because it's a fantastic research and conservation venue. This is our collaborator Hikmet Uzbek in eastern Turkey, and this is his favorite bee wall. It's a wall that is it's vertical, and all different kinds of bees come in and nest in this wall. Many of them dig in the soil to create tunnels into the wall, and then an array of renting bees come in, we call them cavity renters. They come and they secondarily use the abandoned tunnels of the digging bees. This is something that we hope to find in Singapore, is basically a wall with the nesting Amygdala bees, but we haven't been able to find it yet. We need your help to locate the bee nest sites. This is probably a source area for these populations because you have huge numbers of them here, and they may be propagules that then disperse out over the landscape, and this may actually be crucial to maintaining the population of these pollinators. So this is Hikmet Uzbek, and when we were out there, we found Uzbek osmia, which is a bee that's named after him. And when we dug into the soil, wasn't found. Okay, so these are petals. It turns out that bees, including the Singaporean bees, bring plant substrates back to their nest to use in nest construction. So what it's done is it's, with its mandibles, it's cut petals, made a little chamber for its eggs and its larvae. Then it's put a layer of mud around that, and then a second layer of petals. So there's actually two, you can't really see it here, but there's 2 layers of these beautiful petals. And when we were out in the field in Turkey, I emailed my friend in Switzerland. It turned out somebody in Iran had found exactly the same bee, so we co-authored a paper together with our Turkish, Iranian, and Swiss colleagues. And this was in National Geographic. This shows some research in China. And what's happening here is there's bees that nest under this, basically nest inside the cave. And this is a tribe of bees we also have in Singapore. And the parasites come in and sneak into the nest when the mother bee is out. They lay their eggs very stealthily, and then the immature stage is floating around. This is the larva of the parasitic bee. It actually floats on the semi-liquid pollen and nectar mass, which is the food of the bee. And then the parasitic bee larva has big antennae for locating the host. And then often the immature parasite, which is a bee itself, will kill the host bee and then eat the pollen and nectar of the host. So this is exactly the behavior of, say, not exactly, but it's analogous to the behavior of a cuckoo. So we call them cuckoo bees because the bee does not do any work. It doesn't make its own nest. Instead, it stealthily inserts its egg into the top of the earthen cell where the host mother has taken so much trouble to get all the pollen and nectar, and she's built this wonderful receptacle for her offspring. This evil cloak and dagger bee comes in, sneaks in, and this is I think the site where she poked in her abdomen. She laid the egg. The larva grows up, and then some of them have big sickle-shaped mandibles that are specialized for killing the hosts. And then after they kill the host, they just turn into regular grubs and just eat up all the pollen and nectar. Okay. In Singapore, we have several species actually several genera of these parasitic bees, and they're actually quite rare and fascinating. So we're actually even in a way more interested in the parasites than we are in the bees. If you look at bees as a model, like many religions have done, you have to be careful about this because there's several hundred species of highly social bees that work together harmoniously for the good of the group and all this, but there are actually 2,000 species worldwide of these parasitic bees that do absolutely no work, and all they do is run around looking to steal the resources of the hardworking bees. So basically, there's more than maybe 3 times as many parasites as there are exemplary social bees. Something to think about, especially for the Mormons and others who have the bees as their logo. This is bees that we see in China, and I want to point this out as a sort of a plea for everybody who's going out with their camera to other countries in the region, anywhere in Asia. The bee fauna here is very, very poorly known. And it's not like the birds. If in terms of birds, if you go out, you might get the 500th best picture ever taken of that species or something like that, okay? But with the bees, you can find things that are totally new, even at places that are very touristic where everyone goes. So this bee was at the Great Wall of China. This is a male bee sitting on top of the Great Wall of China. This is right below the Great Wall of China in the pine forest where I was looking for the Chinese nuthatch. And while I was doing that, this thing was coming in. This is a female bee who's gathering resin. So some of the bees, including the Singaporean ones, actually use resin to build their nest partitions, to close the nest, to prevent the predators and parasites. And so the female is actually, with her mandibles, is grabbing the resin. So it turned out, when I went to the collection in Beijing, I didn't find any specimens of this whatsoever. It was only when I went to the type collection, where they keep only the original, very, very few specimens upon which the species was described, that I did actually find samples of this. But they're not even in the regular collection in Beijing, and no other collection in the world, and they've never really been, certainly never been photographed before. But this was just on my first short trip to the Great Wall. So anybody with a camera going out anywhere in the region can find animals that have never been photographed before when you're talking about bees, and find new things about their behavior. This is a cloak and dagger bee, which is actually the same species that lives in Singapore, called Therius himalayensis. It's found all the way to the Himalaya and in downtown Beijing. In this case, it's on the flower. This is one of those parasitic bees, the cloak and dagger bees. And because she doesn't do any work, she doesn't have any structures on her legs for carrying pollen or building nests or anything like that. She just flies around, sips nectar on flower, and every once in a while sneaks into the nest of her host. This is a true bumblebee that looks kind of like a skunk that was up in the mountains in Sichuan. And this is a group that we do not have in Singapore because it's a temperate adapted group. But interestingly, there's one species in Hong Kong, but it does not make it to Singapore. You know, our research takes us to the rainforest as well. I'm more familiar with the New World rainforest. But we go to a place like this, you'll notice it's sort of like coming to the dipterocarp forest here. You say, where are the flowers going to be? Okay, how are we going to find the bees in such an environment? So it turns out in the New World we have a trick, which is we can put out chemical baits. You basically put out essential oils. You can put out oil of wintergreen, eucalyptus oil, and things like that. If you're into photography and you ever go to the New World, stop by Whole Foods first, go to the, I'm not joking, go to the essential oils section, buy some of these things, put them out on the leaves, and these blue, red, purple, and green bees will come like magic out of their woodwork. These are all males, and they're orchid bees. And their hind leg is greatly expanded, and it's used as a perfume vial, okay? So these are males. The females never, ever, ever come. They're not interested in the slightest. These are all males. They have sponges on their front legs, and they sponge up the perfume, and they have little slits, which are openings in their giant hind legs. They fill the hind legs up with perfume, and then they have a lek and sort of a mating dance where many males will congregate on the side of the tree and wave their wings, and if they have just the right amount of perfume, then the females will come. And they have to have perfume from different species of orchids. Now, why am I bringing up to talk about Singapore is because we found what may be an analogous case here in Singapore very recently, which is very exciting. But this is only in the New World. This shows what it looks like when you put out this bait. This was bait put out in the tree. All of a sudden you get these giant bees coming out literally like magic out of the woodwork. And because they're all males, they can't sting you, they're harmless. You can handle them, you can pick them up in your hands. It's pretty neat. This shows what it looks like when they're actually visiting a real orchid. So the perfume is actually something that's actually on the surface of the orchid, and they have mops or sponges on the front legs that mop it all up, and then they put it in the expanded hind legs and then fly back to their lecking site. It turns out that some of these actually, instead of collecting orchid perfume, they collect DDT. So when people first went to the Amazon and sprayed for mosquitoes with DDT, these giant purple bees came flying out of the Amazon rainforest, and they were actually attracted to the DDT and collected it and put it into their perfume vials. Pretty weird stuff.
Did it kill them?
I don't think so. Because actually a lot of these perfumes are toxic. Like, you certainly wouldn't want to drink some of these essential oils, right? They're like methyl salicylate or something like that. It's quite potent stuff. But the bees are perfectly capable of handling it. So I think they're sort of adapted to deal with toxic substances. But it is kind of amazing. Now this shows the pollinia of the orchid is affixed to the bee. So in nature, they actually get their perfume by visiting very dedicated orchids, and each orchid places the pollinia in a different place and glues it onto the bee, and then when it visits another orchid, then it will become essentially contact the female part of the orchid and affect pollination. So the males are visiting these orchids exclusively for the perfume, not for pollen, not for nectar, and they affect pollination. I'll show you later an example in Singapore where we have orchids that are also pollinated by a different group of bees, and the same deal with the pollinia on the top of the thorax. So some of our work takes us literally to the opposite side of the world from Singapore. This is Yasuni National Park. This is where the Warani Indians live. And it's literally, if you drill a hole through the center of the earth, from right here, you come out in this national park. And so we go there, and this is a canopy tower that's, I don't know, 100 meters up in the tree or something ridiculous like that. Maybe not that high, but it's way up, super high in the canopy. And the bird watchers would relieve themselves over here in the bushes, and it attracted all kinds of insects as a natural bait. Okay, but we also put out dead chicken, we threw out salt, we threw out sugar, and laundry detergent and all kinds of stuff, and created a giant bait that was swarming with all kinds of, there were turtles, but there were all kinds of bees and who knows what. So the baiting is a way to get things in the forest that you can never get normally. So how do we sample the canopy is a real problem in Singapore as well, because there's a lot of bees that live up in Bukatima in the canopy that we never see. And unfortunately, we don't have such a convenient tower in all parts of the rainforest. So getting onto my research, we collect the bees in very, very large scales. We get their label data. These are from Fujian, China, 1938, and they're identified by the experts, and we put a unique identifier barcode on them. Then we map them on a global basis. This is about 1 million specimens that we've assembled during a project that I was leading for many years. And we map them from all over the world. Huge amount of data from the New World, but in Southeast Asia and all the global data sets, there's really not that much known. So it's a big opportunity for citizen scientists. This just shows how we can just get for whole regions massive coverage for spatiotemporal patterns and show how bees are changing with time. Are they declining? We can actually test that rather than just having anecdotes. We share all the data on the web, and this basic text data is boring, but what's exciting is we share the images of the holotypes and some of the historical information. So what we're doing is we're getting the regional data, like from Malay Peninsula in this case, EXCO FMS Museum. This is a specimen that's actually in the American Museum of Natural History in New York, but by taking these photos, we can essentially make it available to everyone in the world on the internet. So we're making a particular effort to get all the species that live in Singapore and try to get images of them of this sort on the web as quickly as possible. And we integrate everything on species pages that have maps, photos of the live animals on the host flowers, which then link to the flower pages, and images of the holotypes and everything like that. And then text that we scan from different sources and whatnot. We're trying to put all the data together on a web page that then links to dynamic ID guides, which is a different way to ID things. What we're doing here is we're putting the ID guide on the web, and it's dynamic. So rather than go have an app or something like that, you visit a web page, it's live, and you can click on the boxes in any order, and it will dynamically sort through your identification. Then what's kind of neat is that all of our specimens that we get from going around, in this case in Singapore, they map on Singapore on the map. So we're taking the citizen science data, and we're fully integrating it with the professional data. And in essence, we don't really have a difference. If it has a species identification that's reliable and a GPS coordinate, that's all we need to go. And then we actually include, along with the global, official, institutional data from all the main collections in the world, we include the photos with the GPS coordinate then mapped straight on there. The way we mobilize this is we make image databases. This is from my personal image database. And we can have the birds and the butterflies and bees and everything together. But what's interesting is it's automatically linked onto the species page. So whatever content I upload, if I put a species name on there, by the next day it'll be populating the species page. So it's very, very efficient to take whatever you have. It can be butterflies, birds, fungus, fungi, it doesn't matter. You can put it all in this image database and it will go onto literally more than 1 million species pages. This is an example of another citizen science approach that I work on literally every single day, which is, it's only for North America, but I think it exemplifies what we need to have in Singapore and everywhere in the world. What happens is anybody can upload images. This is just from this afternoon at about 3 p.m. All right. And when I see something that I like this wasp here, if I recognize it, I just click on it. I can do that on my phone. It immediately pops up. I can type in on my phone a little comment, pop it in there, and then I can, on my phone, curate the image onto the guide page here. So I'm populating in real time this ID guide that grows and grows and grows and gets expanded and filtered and validated and this and that. And then these records go onto the map and they also they populate the records by month and by locality. And this is all happening dynamically in real time. It's validated by experts. It's very, very efficient. I can do it on my phone. This leads to some really interesting things. So using this system, one of the random people I never met, he submitted a bee with a really, really long face. Okay? We had never seen this, well, I had seen it before, but only as an undescribed species that was sitting in a really old historical collection. But this guy had a new, fresh one, a photo of the live bee, and more importantly, he knew where the nest site was. So through this citizen science site, we were able to locate the nest site, more specimens and live images of the bee, and we were able to recruit this gentleman, David Almquist, as our co-author on the basis of he was able to go out and study the nest, which he found. But all this only happened through the venue of him submitting to the citizen science site. One thing led to another. All of a sudden, we have a new species with the nest. So I'm hoping something like this can happen in Singapore, because there's a lot of species that are really incredible that have never before been seen alive by anybody. So this bee is only known from trap samples, so it's only been passively collected through malaise traps. So it flew into essentially a tent and got killed in alcohol, and that's all we know about it. No one's seen it flying, nobody knows what flowers it visits, and it's a parasite. This bee has no pollen collecting structures. It's a parasitic bee. Nobody knows what the host is. Basically nothing is known. It just showed up in a trap. So there's a real opportunity to go out and find new species for science and new information about life history and things like that. This is a bee actually named for Singapore, Singaporensis, just in 2012. So our species description is ongoing. So we're basically trying to contribute to the cast of characters of Singapore. Zestin So, who's an NParks scholar who's studying abroad at Imperial College London, he made this wonderful bee poster. This is what it looked like in 2013 when I first showed up in Singapore to start my job. And it's a pretty nice array of bees, from our honeybees on the top and our Carpenter Bees and some others. But in just about 2 years, collectively, our bee group has expanded the cast of characters for Singapore to this. And it was certainly not just, it was a combination of Zestin and his collaborators and my lab and John Lee, who did the Nature Society guide. We all work together, we're friends, and collectively we found a lot of amazing bees, and I'll be telling some of their stories in a couple of minutes. We've added another honeybee species, sorted out the Carpenter Bee species. We've got the parasite that I showed you before, and then all of these small, very poorly known bees. And then crucially, we found a huge array of these megachile bees, and they basically more than doubled. So we went from about 10 species to 20 species in the megachile, leafcutter, and resin bees. And this was a combination of activities that brought this about that I'll tell you about. Notice some of the color patterns, like this orange wings with the black. That's a mimicry pattern that we see in Singapore, not just in the bees, but also in wasps and also in Lepidoptera, like moths that mimic them. Here's an example of a bee. It turns out to be really common in Singapore, but basically nobody knew about it. There are 0 described species. There are no named species reported anywhere in the literature from Singapore, but it turns out it's one of the more common bees that we have, the Yellowface bee. You'll notice it doesn't really look much like a bee. It's not very hairy. The reason why is this bee actually eats its pollen and carries it back in the crop, which is an internal structure like the crop of a bird, and then it regurgitates the pollen and nectar into the nest. We see it's very small, so basically everybody overlooked it, but when you go out to the syzygium when it's in full bloom, they're very, very abundant. Another big group in Singapore are the Nomiine bees, and they have some interesting relations with groups like Melastoma. They're buzz pollinators or they do what's called vibratile pollination. So they function like a tuning fork to vibrate the anthers of the plant, and then it shoots out of the poricidal anthers. Basically, the anther has a hole in it. When it vibrates at the right frequency, the bee gets covered in pollen and carries it back to the nest. So you can keep your ear out. If you see a plant like Ardisia or Melastoma, you'll often hear bzzz, and the bee is vibrating its flight muscles, but not actually flying. It's like the clutch is disengaged or something. So it's able to extract the pollen. This is an amazing leg of a bee called Pseudapis siamensis that turns out to be quite common in Singapore, as well as Siam, Thailand. It's got very modified legs for gripping the female during mating, and a lot of strange, like feather-like hairs that you can't see very well, but quite an incredible bee. Now, how do we find out about bees? Our research is not just going out there with nets and catching them that way. The first student to join my lab, Eunice So, did a study on Megachile bees, and that involved putting out a trap nest to try to get them to nest in artificial bamboo tubes, and also looking at the leaves that they cut to build their nest, because they actually use leaves in nest construction, and then looking at the larvae inside the leaf cell. So we're trying to understand that. And in the process of doing this, we found that the bees not only nest in the bamboo, they nest in the mounds of the mud lobster. So the mud lobster is one of the only places that's dry enough for the bees to make a soil nest in the mangrove. And this shows what the leaf, origami leaf cell. I showed you earlier a bee that makes the cells out of petals. This one makes it out of leaves. It cuts it with its mandibles. And here's the mud lobster that made the mound. When we find the nest, it's an opportunity to really study and photograph and even video the behavior and look at their energy budget. How much time do they invest in gathering leaves? How much time in gathering pollen and things like that? So there's a Fabaceae tree in Pasir Ris Park, and they're gathering the orange pollen, carrying it back under their abdomen, because that's how these Megachile bees do it. We're trying to really piece together what flowers do they use for nectar, what pollen resources do they use, and what leaves do they cut. Now, to get all this information, especially about the nectar flowers, they visit many, many different flowers. So we need information from photographers as well to fill in the gaps and get the full range of flowers that they're visiting. So we're trying to, fill in all of the resource use. An amazing thing that happened is the Tiger Orchid. I'm not sure if you're aware of this, but it's the world's biggest orchid by biomass, and it went extinct in Singapore. It was replanted, and then with the big drought, there was the first mass bloom ever of this thing. And it turned out that these Megachile leafcutter bees came like magic out of the forest and were attracted to the scent of the orchid, and they came in, and it started out with Zestin So and colleagues were able to find species that either had not been seen for more than 100 years or had never been seen before in Singapore, and document their pollination behavior in this orchid. So here's a picture showing how the reproductive parts are attaching the pollinia, and it sticks to the back. So to learn more about these Megachile bees, we're also engaging in rooftop garden studies. in collaboration with some Belgian colleagues, and a student who's here named Wishan is working on this as well. And we're finding up on the rooftops that the megachile are actually able to ascend up there and visit plants in that artificial setting. This shows the whole range of species that we're getting. And they mimic each other. So we have resin bees on top and leafcutter bees that have exactly the same pattern, but they've evolved independently the same color. This is the same orchid thing I showed you before. Some behavior we see with the Amygilla blue-banded bee is nectar robbing. It has knife-like mouth parts that cuts into the base of the flower, sticks its tongue in, and steals the nectar without pollinating. This one's very common in Singapore. This is actually a rare forest-associated species that, in this case, I photographed in Panti Forest in Malaysia. But you can find it in the central forest in Singapore. So just like in birds, we have things like blue-rumped parrot that are only very rarely seen in the central forest. Same with the bees. This is one of them. This is the rare forest bee. So we need more photos of those guys. Giant Carpenter Bee. This is from Gardens by the Bay with big blindfolds that it uses to put over the eyes of the female during mating. Because he's male, he can't sting me, and I can hold him in my hands even though he's a giant bee. And here's the female from Jelutong Tower visiting her host plant. These are some very famous bees in Singapore's Alacopa Confusa, a very aptly named bee. It turns out that it's not that at all. It's actually, the correct name is Flavonoaggressans and Aestuens, and there's 2 species. So in the last couple of years, we've been really trying to sort out these cryptic species. And even though they look the same, this one's got a little bit greener wings, more purple. And one of my students named Kia Yi, she did a very careful morphological and phylogenomic study using next-generation sequencing, and together was able to sort out, the males are obvious, but the females are quite similar, but she was able to see some subtle differences like yellow hairs on parts of the abdomen and so forth. One of the Carpenter bees that we found is nocturnal. It turned up in the NTU campus. It has giant simple eyes on top of the head for navigating at night, and it's very rarely seen. But one of my friends, who you may know, Adeline, she found this at NTU, and we had a nice photo session. This shows some of the megachile bees with the pollinia. Just like I showed you with those neotropical ones, it attaches onto the back of the bee. Looks like I'm running out of time. I'll make it really quick. These are social bees, Melaponini. I think Carl's going to talk about them, so I won't go into it too much. This is a nest entrance where these are the bees, and then these looks like a bunch of termites swarming around them. There's different species in Singapore, different mimicry color patterns. We're zooming in using things like morphometrics to try to understand how to identify them by their wings. And we're looking at all the historical specimens in the museum, like Lee Kong Chan Natural History Museum and other sources, to compare where they were in the forest in the 1920s, many different places, and then now more recently they're only in the central forest and so on. And then we can make modern day maps like this showing the diversity in the central forest. Getting into honeybees, this is the most famous Asian honeybee that Carl's going to be talking about. They are medium-sized honeybees and they nest in cavities. Contrast that with a giant honeybee. It's much bigger, red, and it nests in these huge colonies that are on giant tree branches. This is one of the most dangerous animals in Singapore. Then we've got a very tiny honeybee that's so small that you might not even know it's a honeybee. It's Andreniformis, which is native to Sundaland and typical of dipterocarp forest. But it has a small nest attached to a tree branch. Okay? And notice the black color. One of the biggest surprises since I came here was this Apis florea showing up. It's an exotic bee that's supposed to be in the seasonal areas like Thailand, the monsoonal areas. And it showed up here in Singapore, so we think it came in on the port or something like that as an exotic species. You can keep your eye out for it and maybe help us to document its spread. We're trying to see where it's spreading across Singapore.
It's all over Sentosa now.
Okay.
Yeah, Sentosa Cove.
Well, see, that's new information, because I first found it at West Coast Park in 2012, and now it seems to be gradually expanding across Singapore. So with that, I'll just want to say that there's a lot of bees in Singapore. We found this many so far, or these are the ones Zestin's been able to photograph. There's more than 100, we think, and maybe you can help us out to photograph them and find out more about what they do and why. I just want to thank everybody, in particular my global collaborators, members of my lab, especially Eunice Xiaoxiang and Kiai, who I talked about their work in particular, and then Zestin So of N Parks and John Lee.